Greetings and salutations. Today we will be covering the disappearance of Brian Shaffer. From an outside perspective, it would seem Brian Shaffer had a perfect life. He had been blessed with a loving family, along with having what was purported to be a great girlfriend, and a rather active social life. Add to that the bright future he had in the medical field. Unfortunately, in 2006, that promising future would vanish, along with the man himself. The event in question occurred during a night out with a friend, when the young student disappeared, with nary a trace. It was as if he had just fallen off the face of the earth, leaving his friend who was out with him, along with all that knew him, rather surprised. The investigation into his disappearance has left authorities digging deeper and deeper still into a veritable rabbit hole of unanswered questions, where every time something is answered, a new question arises to take its place. So if you'd like to know more about a case that has been classed as being a confounding conundrum which has captured the imaginations of countless curious investigators, please remain with me as I tell you the story of Brian Shaffer. This case starts all the way back in 2006 with Brian Shaffer, a 27-year-old medical student at Ohio State University. This was also where he would meet his girlfriend, who coincidentally was also a second-year med student by the name of Alexis Wagner. They had had a whirlwind romance. It was to the point that Alexis believed that Brian was on the verge of proposing on the very opportune moment, which was their planned vacation to Miami, which they had intended to have that April. Unfortunately, things would not go as well as expected for the lovely couple. In March, Brian's mother had passed away from a disease known as myelodysplasia. It must be noted that Brian and his mother had been very close throughout his entire life, and the loss of which had dragged Brian down and crushed his spirits. However, even when dragged down, Brian would not let his negative emotions get the best of him, and he was able to put on a brave mask to the point where those around him believed that everything was well. He even showed a great degree of excitement for the Miami trip. It is important to note that even though Brian was pursuing a medical career, it was widely known that his true passion and his true desire was to dedicate his life to music, and that he would often speak about his true dream being living the easy life as a musician, essentially unshackled from the bounds that was the career he had dedicated so much of his life towards achieving. It went as far as people pointing towards his MySpace page, in which he had stated becoming a doctor was little more than a job to him, and all those investments of time and resources were just temporary until he could put his band together and put out a record. There have been many who have put an emphasis on this desire to leave behind what essentially made up his life as an explanation to what happened to Brian. It would be on Friday, March 31st of 2006, just at the beginning of spring break, when the disappearance of the bright young medical student would occur. It must be noted that this particular spring break would have been exceedingly important to Brian, as a release valve of sorts, due in particular to March being exceedingly stressful and difficult. Not only had his mother died, but he had been allowed little to no time to decompress or work out any issues that would have been spawned from that, due to having to pull all-nighters and constantly focus on his medical school exams and studying. It was to the point that even though the vacation with his significant other was 3 days away, an early spring break celebration seemed to be in order. It would be on that very same day that Brian would end up meeting with his father for what neither of them knew would be their last time. His father was a man by the name of Randy Shaffer, who would take his son out to eat some steaks at a steakhouse. During their meal, his father would note how exhausted his son was, to the point he would tell him that he did not think he should go out with his friend William Clint Florence later that night, which he had told his father he intended to do. The father made an attempt to appeal to his son's better judgment and tell him that he should catch an early night and rest. Unfortunately, Brian would reject his father's advice and specified that a month long of studying and hardship meant that he just needed a boys' night out. It would be 9 p.m. when Brian and Clint would meet up at a college bar by the name of the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Said bar was in the Arena District of Columbus, right by the intersection of Chittenden Avenue and Summit Street. While this was going on, Brian's girlfriend was visiting her parents all the way in Toledo. His girlfriend would receive a call from Brian at about 10, where he would tell her goodnight as they exchanged pleasantries with each other, ending the call with each of them telling the other, "I love you." According to her, Brian appeared to be completely normal throughout the entire call. Not a word out of place, not an uneasy shift in his tone to be found. He seemed utterly and completely normal. Little did the young woman realize this would be the last time she would ever speak to the man she believed she would marry. That night, Brian and Clint would go on a right proper bar crawl, visiting a total of 7 bars. Clint would eventually tell authorities that they would end up drinking and taking a shot at every single location they stopped, before arriving in the short north. It was there where they would be joined by one of Clint's friends, a young woman by the name of Merida Reed. The duo now became a trio, and they would make their way back to the Ugly Tuna and arrive at about 1:15 a.m. Then, 45 minutes later, they would realize that the bar was closing. However, what they would quickly notice was that the trio had once more become a duo. Brian was nowhere to be found. The worried duo would proceed to attempt to call Brian and make contact with him. Unfortunately, the man would not pick up his phone. As the bar was closing, they would end up waiting outside for him. When they noticed that he had not come out with the rest of the patrons, they made the assumption that he had just went home by himself, which was just a short walk from the bar proper. However, it must be noted that while not the easiest journey for someone who would be at this time rather inebriated, it would not be outside the norm. Unfortunately, Brian had not gone home. Following this, his girlfriend and father would attempt to make multiple calls throughout the entirety of the rest of the weekend, and sadly, all their efforts would be for naught, since Brian would never pick up the phone again. It wouldn't be until he had missed his flight on Monday, April the 3rd, that he would be reported to the authorities as missing. At this point, Randy would have lost both his wife and his son within the short time frame of a month. This tragedy resonated deeply with one Sergeant John Hurst. Being a father himself and dreading the position that Randy was in caused him to fully dedicate himself, along with his fellow investigators, into the search. Under most circumstances, someone disappearing from a busy bar would leave some sort of clue, a hint, or some evidence of where he might have gone to or what might have caused him to disappear. Strangely enough, this was not the case with Brian. There was scant information detectives could act upon. It was to the point that they couldn't even be certain whether Brian had actually gone missing or had just wandered off under his own cognizance, or even if someone had been responsible and or maliciously caused his disappearance. However, authorities would start in one of the most obvious places, checking all surveillance footage, specifically CCTV cameras which were rife in the area due to being seen as somewhat of an unscrupulous and unsafe environment. However, strangely enough, this would do little to truly help the investigation. All the footage did was leave investigators with more questions than they had started with. What was not out of the norm was that at 1:15 a.m., Brian was seen on CCTV cameras riding up the escalators with Clint and Meredith. Shortly after this, Clint and Brian were seen supposedly flirting with a pair of women. Their names were Brighton Sacco and Amber Ruick. It was claimed that Brian went as far as kissing Brighton in the neck. Then, at 1:57 a.m., the cameras would once again show our missing medical student talking with Brighton, who supposedly put her phone number into Brian's own phone. After this, she would head back into the bar in order to use the restroom. Once she returned, she was surprised that Brian was no longer there. Confoundingly enough, the footage shows Brian re-entering the bar, but never exiting. Unfortunately, this would be the last verifiable image of Brian we would have. The strange thing is that no CCTV camera afterwards would show Brian exiting the bar at all. And even after 2 a.m., when the bar was closed, the cameras would capture nothing, even though the menagerie of patrons exiting the bar had been captured, to which investigators would use said footage to individually identify each and every patron that appeared and accounted for them in order to see if Brian was in the mix, leaving, and he had just been missed. Footage from other cameras around the area were also checked, but once again, it was of little use. There was no trace of Brian found in any of the footage. He really did seem to have vanished from the face of the earth. Brighton and Amber were quickly considered suspects. However, just as quickly, they would be cleared of any involvement. Scores of officers would dedicate long nights and days to the search. Unfortunately, not a hint of Brian was found anywhere. Searchers would go as far as to check all the hospitals along with their morgues and have police scour the sewers along with homeless camps, shelters, and having sniffer dogs search any area where he could have potentially been, including the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Then, when this did not work, more rudimentary investigatory tools were used. Signs and posters were plastered all over town, showing images of the missing man, along with a rather sizable reward being announced. And as expected, with the promise of money, there were supposed sightings everywhere, from Texas to Michigan, some even going as far as Mexico and Sweden. The unfortunate part of any monetary reward is the great potential for false alarms and misidentifications, which inevitably would draw attention and resources from proper information about the case. Inspectors and detectives would go to the extremes, to the point that they would go knock door to door asking people if they had seen Brian. It is important to remember that Brian's apartment had been ransacked by some criminal, which did revitalize this search, with the assumption being that the burglary had something to do with his disappearance. Unfortunately, it was not connected in any way, and it was just a crime of opportunity. The efforts to find Brian would spread so far to the point that even famous musicians would take part in the search effort. A member of Pearl Jam, Eddie Vidal, would stop in the midst of one concert and ask his fans and those at the concert for any information or possible leads that they could have on Brian's disappearance. Sadly, nothing would come of this. There was no actionable information turned in. Brian's father would become desperate enough as to go on and hire a psychic for help to find his son. Said psychic would go on to tell him that his son was likely somewhere within the Olentangy River. The psychic's statements would go on to nearly cost the distraught father his very life, since he chose to search the river by himself in a desperate attempt to find any trace of his son. Once again, this had been little more than a dead end. Brian's girlfriend would call his cell phone every single night in the hopes that he or anyone would have picked up and potentially given them a lead to what had happened. Now, it is very important to note that none of her calls would go through. However, one call, months after his disappearance, actually did ring a few times before being manually disconnected. While suspicious, the phone company itself would go on to suggest that it was a cellular glitch. However, they would make note that the phone had pinged on Hilliard, which was just 14 short miles from where Brian had vanished. Since his disappearance, Brian's phone had never been used, along with his credit card never being touched. And while this is a bad sign, pointing to him likely no longer being alive, it did help the search focus while discounting some possibilities. The search initially would focus on the area around the Ugly Tuna Saloona and the Olentangy River, which flows rather near the bar. The river had been searched multiple times by divers, boats, sonar equipment, but no evidence of Brian's whereabouts would be found. The police would initially suspect that Brian may have fallen into the river, which was noted to have strong currents and rather vicious whirlpools. Unfortunately, the extensive search turned up nothing. Now onto the theories surrounding the disappearance of Brian Shaffer, which is considered to be one of the most perplexing unsolved cases in recent history. Here are some of the main theories and suspects which have been discussed by the media and investigators. The first and foremost would be foul play, which is one of the most common theories around Brian's disappearance, stating that he was potentially the victim of foul play at the hands of someone within the Ugly Tuna Saloona. It is believed that Brian had the possibility of getting into a confrontation or a fight with someone at the bar, and that person might have killed him within the bar or without. It could be something as minor as looking at someone the wrong way, or someone's significant other looking at Brian in a way that was not appreciated, or even accidentally scuffing someone's shoe. Anything really could cause an altercation. However, this theory does not quite follow, since no one in the bar remembers any sort of altercation occurring that night. It is also notable that Brian had no enemies to speak of, and was generally seen by most people in a very positive light. It would have been little more than a random act of violence. However, there is one major snag with the theory, being the CCTV cameras, which covered almost the entire area around the bar, to the point where not capturing anything would mean that if he was jumped, it would have had to happen within the bar, where all the patrons would be able to see. Another widely reported theory is that he is still in the bar, that Brian potentially died somewhere within the bar, and in an attempt to avoid a lawsuit or criminal charges, Brian's body was somehow hidden within the bar that night, and is either there or was dismembered and disposed of shortly after. Some proponents of this theory state that potentially the bar staff and owners could have switched out the CCTV camera footage and replaced it with footage that showed nothing as they got rid of Brian's body. There are some that believe that he is either beneath the floorboards of the establishment or within the walls proper. This would potentially explain why he was not caught on any of the cameras. However, this theory falls completely apart due to the police's thorough investigation of the Ugly Tuna, which included bringing sniffer dogs in, and it cannot be understated how good those dogs are at finding someone. The other possibility is that his body would have been dismembered. However, the sniffer dogs would still have picked up something. While technically not impossible, it is a rather implausible theory. Another theory is accidental death. Some believe that Brian could have accidentally just meandered into the river or into the open construction site, drowning or falling into one of the holes that would later be filled with concrete at the construction site. However, extensive searches of the river and the surrounding area turned up no trace of Brian. Now, a potential theory why this happened was that he potentially could have fallen into one of the holes that was filled with concrete, having any trace of him permanently buried, entombed within the construction site. However, statements from the construction team contradict this theory. They stated that it would be nearly impossible for him to have been within the hole while it was being filled and not being seen rather quickly. On the other hand, there are some who say that the construction team is just covering for each other, as one would tend to do when potentially faced with the charges of killing someone, accidentally or otherwise. The fourth theory is that of a deliberate disappearance, where some suggest that Brian may have deliberately orchestrated his disappearance in order to start a new life, since it was stated by Brian multiple times that his career and life trajectory were anything but what he wanted, since he had no real passion for what he was doing. And when you consider the potential trauma that the death of his mother would have caused, he might have been feeling somewhat flighty, especially with the pressure that would have been built up from the exams. However, this theory is considered highly unlikely by investigators, as Brian had no history of running away or being generally unhappy. It must also be noted that a detective would go on to tell the media that Brian had 100% not left through the front entrance or in any form of disguise. Now, one suspect in the investigation is Brian's friend, William Clint Florence. William was with him at the Ugly Tuna on the night he disappeared, which would cause the investigators to look at him as a potential suspect. And there are those who still fully believe that Clint was in some way responsible for Brian's death and disappearance, or they believe that at least he has not shared all the information he has about the disappearance. This in part is due to his refusal to take a lie detector test, which is used by some government agencies. Another potential suspect is that of the convicted serial killer who was active in the Ohio area during the time. This was Joseph Price. Some have speculated that he might have been the one to have done Brian in. However, there is no evidence to support this theory, other than the fact that he was in the general area of the state when Brian disappeared. Sadly, even if the information does lead us to find some answers, one of the people most affected by Brian's disappearance will never receive any form of closure. Brian's father died in 2008, only to be found the next day by some neighbors. Here, things would once again become more confusing. When an online condolence book was created, it was found that one entry read, "To Dad, love Brian, U.S. Virgin Isles," and suddenly there was renewed hope in the case. The remaining family and the woman who had once been his significant other had a faint trace they could cling to. Unfortunately, this was some sick prank pulled on the beleaguered family. This was sent via computer from a public library. Despite the extensive investigations by law enforcement, private investigators, and internet sleuths, Brian's whereabouts still remain unknown, and his case continues to generate interest and speculation. Unfortunately, we are still no closer to finding out whatever happened to Brian Shaffer. If you remained with me until the end, I thank you, and I do hope you stay tuned and subscribe for more content.